Today we're going to be looking at over 20 plus PlayStation 2 games on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro to see how well this console handles PlayStation 2 emulation. Starting with Blitz The League, and this game is meant to be running at 60 frames per second, and we'll have the target frames per second in the top left corner for all the games, and it does vary game from game. Some games are PAL, some games are NTSC, some games are meant to run at only 30 frames per second, so we will have the target FPS in the top left corner. And we will be looking at G. On the top right, we'll be looking at G predominantly for the frames per second, but then as we start messing with some of the settings, trying to get a little bit more out of the system, G becomes a little bit less representative for the target frames per second, and V becomes a bit more representative. So we'll have all the information there for you to see how well the games perform and the different types of settings that we're changing. But what you can see to start with, Blitz The League runs at 60 frames per second, no problem throughout most of the game. Now all of the settings as standard will be as Ether SX2 is installed, and any settings that we do change, you'll see me changing them so you'll understand how we're getting the most out of these games. The next game we'll be looking at is Bully, or Canis Canem Edit, and this game is meant to be running at 30 frames per second. And as you can see, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro with the basic settings of Ether SX2 runs Bully at no issue at 30 frames per second. The standard GPU renderer that we are using is OpenGL, and for some of the games we will switch that up to Vulkan, but you'll see when we do that. But as you can see, Bully is running really smoothly and pretty much as it would on the PS2. The next game is Burnout Revenge, and this is where we first start to see the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro struggle. Burnout Revenge is meant to be running at 60 frames per second, but with the standard settings, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is struggling to get even halfway there at 30 frames per second. The first setting we'll change is we'll change OpenGL to the Vulkan GPU renderer and see if that makes any difference. As you can see, that makes little difference at all and potentially makes things a little bit worse. Burnout Revenge is a graphically intense game and one of the later games in the PlayStation 2 library, so it is going to be harder to run. But the next thing we'll mess about with is some underclocking, and we'll start off with some mild underclocking. This improves things a little bit, squeezing out a few extra frames per second, but it's still not quite good enough. Pushing things a little bit more, we'll change the cycle rate to 75%. And you can see instantly this makes a huge difference and brings us a lot closer to that 60 frames per second target. But it's still not quite good enough, so we'll tinker about a little bit more. Pushing the cycle rate all the way down to 50% makes another impressive change, and we are getting a lot closer to the speed that this game should be running. There's definitely moments where it does start to struggle again, but it is a much more enjoyable experience. Finally, pushing things to the limit, we're going to go for a maximum underclock and see if we can get that 60 FPS. At this point, V and G are no longer representative, so we've got to look more at V to see if we're close to that 60 frames per second. And this is starting to feel a lot more like the game should feel. It's got that raw blistering speed that you expect from the PlayStation 2 version. And it's really good to see that messing about with the settings and changing things really can squeeze out a lot of performance from the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, even when it seems like it was going to struggle. Next up, we'll be looking at Def Jam Fight for New York, and this again is meant to be running at 60 frames per second, and straight out of the box it looks like it has no issues. Once again, we're back to the normal settings here, no underclocking, OpenGL renderer, and it's just a pleasurable experience with no issues, no need to mess around with any of the settings. Next up, we'll be looking at Digimon Rumble Arena, 60 frames per second again, and straight out of the box there are no issues. The Retroid Pocket 4 Pro handles this exactly as a PlayStation 2 would, giving you a really solid gaming experience. Next up is Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3. This one's a little bit different to the other games and has a target FPS of 30 to start with. And once again, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is having no issues with this game, hitting the native frames per second that was intended for the original PS2. What I do really like about XIII is how the frames per second goes red, white or green depending on how well the system is running, which gives a nice visual indication. As you can see with God of War, our next game, a game that's meant to run at 60 frames per second but is struggling around the 40 and 45. But changing the GPU renderer from OpenGL to Vulkan completely changes this and brings the experience right back up to that 60 frames per second that we should see. There are a handful of PS2 games on XIII that really react well when changing between GPU renderers, and God of War is one of them. Running it with Vulkan really gives you that solid experience that you would get from the PlayStation 2 and shows how powerful this system is at emulating PS2 games. Next up is Gran Turismo 4, and another game that's meant to be running at 60 frames per second. And this, again, another great experience, straight out the box, no issues with the basic settings of XIII. Gran Turismo 4 is running pretty much at 60 frames per second throughout the whole experience with no issues whatsoever. A really enjoyable experience for a game that I thought actually would push the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro a little bit more than it does. Next up, another racing game, and Kinetica, once again 60 frames per second, running with no issues whatsoever on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, and a really great experience. Playing this game at full speed on a handheld device really is enjoyable, and whereas we could play it on the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, you can definitely see the difference when we're getting the full frames per second that we expect. Next up is Madden 09, and this game is meant to be running at 50 frames per second. Once again, and as seems to be the consistent theme throughout this video, there are no issues whatsoever. The only issue with any of these games is how bad I am at playing them while trying to watch the screen through a camera and not doing a very good job of it, if I'm being honest. Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition with a target FPS of 30 and the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro handles it with ease. There's the odd fraction of a moment where you might see a little dip, but for the most part it's a completely solid experience. Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks, now this is meant to be 60 FPS, but as we can see straight away, it's struggling to hit 40 FPS with the standard settings of XIII. Once again, we'll have to go into the settings, play around a bit and see what we can achieve. First off, jumping over to Vulcan, and we can see an instant difference with Shaolin Monks. Similar to God of War, this is a game that's meant to be run using the Vulcan GPU renderer on XIII. OpenGL just doesn't do enough. And when we are using Vulcan, we get the full 60 FPS experience. No slowdowns, no jittering, just buttery smooth PS2 emulation. Moto GP, and this is a game that should be running at 50 FPS, and unlike Shaolin Monks, we don't have to mess around with the settings at all. Straight out of the box, no issues, 50 frames per second throughout. Need for Speed Underground 2, and this might be the first huge test of the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. Now, Need for Speed Underground 2, even on the PS2, struggled at times and was only meant to ever run at 30 frames per second. And on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, we can see how difficult this game is to run. If we try jumping from OpenGL over to Vulcan, we don't get much difference either. Before we even race, we can see how the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is struggling with this. And if we jump over to Vulcan, it doesn't make a difference either. Messing around with the underclocking, going for a mild underclock at 75%, and straight away we can see a significant improvement. Now, it does look like this is running a lot closer to what we should have experienced on the PlayStation 2, but honestly, it feels very jittery, and I'm struggling now to remember if this felt as jittery as it did on the PS2 as it does now. Messing about with the settings even more just to try and squeeze as much out of it as we can, and we can see we're not going to get much more than we do with a mild underclock and 75%. Dropping it down to 50 doesn't make a huge difference, and even if we go for the maximum underclock, it actually makes things worse. I think the best setting you can go if you want to go for Need for Speed Underground 2 is a mild underclock at 75%. But honestly, I'm struggling to enjoy this experience, and I'm going to have to do a bit of research as to how different it does feel on the PS2 natively. Resident Evil 4, another game that's meant to run at 30 frames per second, but this is a lot smoother and a lot more comfortable to play. Games like Need for Speed Underground 2 and Resident Evil 4 came out late in the life cycle of the PS2, so they do push the system to the limits, so there's no surprise to see these being the hardest games to run on XIII. But really pleased to see that Resident Evil 4 plays really well and as I remember it on the PS2. Next up, another beast of a game to emulate and potentially the hardest of the lot, and that is Shadow of the Colossus. Now, to put it into context, Shadow of the Colossus on the PS2 struggled to keep up to 30 frames per second on the native hardware. It was known to drop down to 15 frames per second on occasions anyway. So, in all fairness, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro does a pretty fantastic job of emulating that on this device. It does struggle to keep the 30 frames per second, but like we said, it struggled on the PS2 anyway. And when we start to mess around with the settings a little bit, bringing out the mild underclock and changing the cycle down as well, we do start to get a much smoother experience and something I could definitely consider as playable. Now, we didn't have a lot of experience with Shadow of Colossus on the original PS2, so it's hard for me to compare this to how it used to feel. It doesn't feel great, if I'm being honest, but as we saw with Need for Speed Underground 2, and as is the history of Shadow of the Colossus, some of these games just didn't run as smooth as we maybe would have hoped to, even on the PS2 hardware. And I think the fact that the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is running this anywhere near what we would have expected just shows what a fantastic system this is for PS2 emulation. Another 30 FPS game, but this one gives the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro nowhere near as hard a time as some of the other games we just looked at, and that's Persona 3. A really gorgeous game to look at, but not one that's really going to push the PS2 too far anyway. And we can see that in the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro emulation as well. The game runs smoothly, keeping up to 30 frames per second with no issues, and we haven't had to mess around with any of the settings anywhere.
Don't tell anyone what you saw, okay? See you later.
Next up is EA Shox, a game we love to play on our emulators here on the Chronic Spartan channel. And to start with, you can see instantly that this game doesn't only run slowly, but also has some serious graphical issues, and that's because it's running in OpenGL. This is a game that has to run using the Vulkan renderer. Not only for the speed, but for the actual graphical integrity of the game as well. When we do switch over to Vulkan, it is a buttery smooth experience and really, really enjoyable. I think it's a game that has some great graphics and a real great sense of speed that gives you a really good experience for PlayStation 2 emulation. Simpsons Hit and Run, a game we usually play on the GameCube emulators, but I thought it'd be good to see how this runs on the PS2. With a target FPS of 60, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro does a solid job. It struggles to keep right up to the 60 FPS, and you can see it dipping down into the 40s on occasions, but in all fairness, it does a pretty solid job. And it never detracts from the gameplay. It keeps it close enough to the 60 frames per second that if you aren't looking at the FPS in the top right corner, you're not going to notice any slowdowns. We can mess around with the settings and maybe squeeze out an extra FPS here or there, but it's not going to make a huge difference. But in all honesty, I don't think you really need to mess around too much to try to squeeze out those FPS, because as it stands, it's a great experience anyway. So Reaver 2, and this is a 50 FPS game, and straight out of the box it's running with no issues. Very interesting game, especially with the fact that there's some graphical differences to other games, especially when you can switch into the Spirit realm, which I thought could test emulators, but Aether SX2 and the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro seems to run this with no issues whatsoever. Timesplitters 2, and this is an odd game. This is a game that seems to run not as well on some high-end devices and well on lower-end devices. Either way, on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, this is a game that should be running at 60 frames per second, but we can see that it struggles. It hits around the 40, 45, so we'll have to tinker around with the settings a little bit to see if we can get a bit more from it. Changing the GPU renderer from OpenGL to Vulkan doesn't really make a big bit of difference, and I'm starting to see the pattern where you can kind of predict the games where this will make a difference or not. We're still seeing it running at around about 45 to 50, but certainly not up at that 60 that we need. Now, it's not an unplayable experience, but it does feel like it's in a little bit of slow motion. If we go in and mess around with the underclock settings, we can see if we can get a little bit more from this. Using a mild underclock with a cycle rate of 75%, we can squeeze a little bit more out of this, getting more into the 50 frames per second and seeing definitely a bit more speed in this game, but it is still a game that struggles to get right up to that 60 FPS. Next up is the classic Silent Hill 2. Now this game should be running at 30 frames per second, and we can see it does with no issues whatsoever. No need to mess around with the settings or change renderers or anything. You can just sit back and enjoy this creepy tale in all its glory on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. Next up, another classic, The Warriors, and another game that should be running at 30 FPS. And straight out of the box, again, 30 FPS, no issues on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, with no tinkering needed. Back-to-back 30 FPS games here, and we're looking at 13. And this one, it does struggle a little bit more to keep up to the 30 frames per second, running at around about 25, but honestly you can hardly notice the impact whatsoever.
Yeah.
And for such a graphically gorgeous game, honestly, I love the graphics in this game so much. Cell shading has kind of been done now, but this was one of the first times I ever saw it, and I still think to this day it is such a visually gorgeous experience, and it's great to see it running smoothly on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. Next up, one of my absolute favourites on the PS2, and that's 007 Nightfire. Now this one's quite interesting because the driving sections seem to intentionally run around half the frames per second of the first person shooter sections. Now this game is meant to run at 50 FPS, which means that during the driving sections it's 25 FPS. Now I did think that maybe it should have been running at 30 frames per second in the driving sections, so I did try to squeeze out a bit more performance, but from the looks of it, 25 frames per second is where it's meant to sit, and it does a great job of doing that. Over in the first person shooter sections, you can see that it runs at 50 frames per second with no issue whatsoever. Next up is 18 Wheeler, basically the big rig version of Crazy Taxi, and this is meant to run at 30 frames per second, and straight out the box 30 frames per second with no issues whatsoever.
Something smells really strange. I don't know if it is the flowers or what, but something just doesn't smell normal.
Next up is 24 the game, and this is definitely the biggest test that the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro has had. This should be running at 60 frames per second, but it really struggles. And as you can see at the beginning, with the basic settings, it's struggling to get up to 20 frames per second. Changing the renderer to Vulkan makes no difference whatsoever, and we're struggling to even see 10 frames per second in some sections. Hopefully with the underclocking we can get some more performance out of it, and going to a mild underclock at 75% we see an instant difference. Now this definitely looks now much closer to how the game should be played. This is another game I hadn't originally played on the PS2, so I can't say what it was like for like on the PS2, but the speed definitely feels right. But what does feel a little bit off is it does feel a little bit choppy. There are moments that even with the underclocking it still does struggle a bit, but you could definitely get a playable experience out of this. But it is starting to make me wonder how badly some games did run on the PS2 natively, and maybe we were just a lot more forgiving back then for some of these games. Next up is 50%. Next up is 50 Cent Bulletproof, and I believe this game should be running at 50 frames per second, but I'm not sure if because this is the PAL version that I've got that it's down to 25, so the equivalent difference between 60 Hz and 50 Hz. But it does seem to be running smoothly, and no changes to the settings make any difference whatsoever, giving for a thoroughly playable experience. Next up is Ace Combat Distant Thunder, and this is a game that should be running at 50 frames per second, and it runs buttery smooth with no issues in terms of the speed of the game. There is one big glaring issue, and that is the sun, and you'll see that in a minute. The sun has got a huge weird rectangle around it, and I hope that changing the GPU renderer might solve that, going from OpenGL to Vulkan or backwards, but it made no difference whatsoever. There seems to be a bit of an oddity in this game when it comes to emulating it, but I'm pleased to say that's the only issue there is. A little bit jarring when you're in the middle of a dogfight, but it doesn't really stop you from enjoying this awesome game experience. As you can see, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is an absolute beast when it comes to PlayStation 2 emulation, with most games working and the games that don't work, or the games that are slower, being in the minority. This is what I hoped for with the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, and I'm so pleased to see that this is the case. Finally, a decently priced handheld emulator that can solidly play PlayStation 2 games. This is what I've been waiting to see for a long time, and I'm so happy to see it. I absolutely cannot wait to see how this is going to smash GameCube emulation, which we'll see in a follow-up video, which I will have linked here as soon as it is out.